Mark. That's where we're going to camp out for the most part tonight. We're going to continue our study on themes in the Gospels. We've made it through an introduction, and then we made it through the Gospel of Matthew. If you remember, when we looked at Matthew, one of the things, the main theme that we noticed was this theme of the outcast. That Matthew seems to have a special message for the people who are on the fringes of society. Specifically, you notice this in his dealing with the Pharisees. If you think you're in, you're out. And if you think you're out, then you're in. It seems to be like a main theme in Matthew's gospel. It was a really, really interesting to see how every chance he got, it seems, Matthew took that chance to make the point about the outcast being a part of the kingdom of God, and that really was part of his gospel. Part of his good news is that this kingdom that is coming is for the outcast. That's great news. And really, it was beautifully tied in because that is Matthew's story. He was a tax collector, an outcast of outcasts, and yet Jesus saw fit to bring him to be one of the 12. And so Matthew wrote from a very personal place with a very personal message that the kingdom of God, the gospel, the good news of the kingdom of heaven is that it's for the outcast. Then we get to the Gospel of Mark. There are some really, really similar parts of Matthew and Mark. In fact, when you read through it, some of the stories are so similar, it's like they were hearing the stories told and both wrote it down the exact same way. There are parts of it that are just like almost verbatim, the same story. And then there are things about Matthew and Mark that are nothing alike. The way the books are written would be one of those things. When you read through, and you can do this quickly, when you read through Matthew, just flip to a random page there in Matthew. You'll notice there are a couple things. Like I just flipped over, we got Matthew 21. I am looking at a quote here in the middle of Matthew about a quote from the Old Testament. You flip all the way back. Let's go to like the early chapters in Matthew, and you've got quotes from the Old Testament all over the place, especially Matthew 1, 2, 3, and 4. You've got all over the place. Matthew is taking the time to put narrators' quotations of the Old Testament in his book. Mark is a little different. In fact, the only narrator quotation of the Old Testament comes in Mark chapter 1 and verse 2 and 3. And then he doesn't do it again for the entire book. Now, Jesus will quote things in his teaching, but Mark doesn't. The narrator does not quote. That's different, right? Okay, well, there's other differences too. In Matthew, you'll notice these enormous sections of teaching. I have my Bible, I think I've shown it to some of you guys. My Bible doesn't have the red letter edition, right? So it's barely even the Bible, you know what I mean? But it doesn't have the red letter edition, which was a bummer. And so what I did is I went through and I underlined in red all the words of Christ. And as you're going through the Gospels, you know which one's really difficult to do that in? Matthew. Do you know why? Because there are several times where Matthew records sermons or long times of teaching. I mean, the entirety of Matthew 5, 6, and 7 are underlined in my Bible. And it took forever, all right? Mark was a little easier. There aren't nearly as many long teachings in the Gospel of Mark. The teachings, there are some that are, maybe a chapter or so, but not 3 chapters long. Matthew does that not once, but at least 2 different times. I think 3, but at least 2 different times of that length, where it's nearly 3 full chapters of Jesus' teaching, continuous teaching. All right, so that's a major difference in the way in which they decided to write down their Gospels. Then you've got the pacing. You notice Matthew is 28 chapters long. 28 chapters in the Gospel of Matthew. Mark told the same story in half the time. Only 16 chapters. And you probably know that because if you're anything like me, when you decided to read the Gospels for the first time, you sat down and said, which one is shortest? Let me knock that one out and get my momentum going. All right, Mark is only 16 chapters compared to Matthew's 28. And so you've got some differences in the way that they're written. Why would there be differences? I mean, if these 2 guys are writing the same story, why are there such differences in the way that these are written? I think the answer is very simple. Their agenda was different. I think this can make us uncomfortable. I want you to know that just because you have an agenda doesn't mean you're not writing the truth, okay? I think that is a true statement across the board. And Matthew very clearly had an agenda in his gospel. Matthew had a group of people he was writing to, and because of that, he crafted his gospel in a way that would communicate to those people. So he was writing to the Jews, and he wrote and emphasized things that the Jews would care about, like genealogies. Mark did not write about genealogies. Mark was writing to Gentiles who didn't care nearly as much about Jewish genealogies, and so he wrote it differently. Now, Matthew had his agenda, and he was writing, like we mentioned last time, to encourage the outcast, right? In his gospel, Mark's agenda seems very different. So we have to ask the question: if Matthew's audience was the Jews, and in a lot of ways specifically the marginalized or the outcasts in society, who is Mark's gospel written to? Matthew was written to them. Who is Mark's gospel written to? Well, most of the time you're going to hear that Mark was written to Gentiles. You might hear that Mark was written to Greeks. I think to narrow it down very specifically, Mark was probably written to specifically Romans. This makes the most sense to me because Rome was the superpower at the time when Mark was written. The Roman emperor was like the king of the world when Mark was written. And Roman culture would have been the predominant culture across the ancient Near East where Mark would have lived, where Jesus lived. And so to write specifically to Romans makes a lot of sense. I also think it makes sense as we study a little bit more. But Mark's audience was a group of Romans. So if we know that Matthew's audience was Jews and they valued certain things, what does Mark's audience value? Right? If Mark is writing to Romans, what are the things they are going to care about? Now, that's important to know why Mark is writing the way that he's writing. Let's just think about this. Romans value Western thinking. We've talked a little bit about this before. Eastern versus Western thinking. We're Westerners, okay? And so we think this way. If I am going to tell you, let's just say, for example, I'm going to tell you that our Praise for the Lord songbooks are the best songbook. I'm going to say it, then I'm going to say 3 reasons why I said it, and then I'm going to conclude with, and that's why. And I'm going to be very direct and very clear and just lay it out for you. That's why these are the best songbooks, okay? Easterners don't do that. Easterners think very differently. Instead, they're probably just going to tell you a story about, I don't know, maybe a story about 2 different churches. In one church, they were very similar, and there were just all these similarities between, they seemed to parallel each other perfectly, but one church in the end, all the people leave, and the other church, all the people stay, and then they won't say it blatantly. It'll just be a almost offhand detail in the middle of the story that one church used Praise for the Lord songbooks, and the other church used songs of faith and praise. And it'll be up to the reader to understand there was a specific difference buried within the story, and that's what they wanted you to get. Okay, that's Eastern thought. Storytelling, discovery, kind of go on the journey and dig, right? Dig into this. Find out why one church died and one church didn't. It doesn't matter what songbook you use. Let me be very clear, okay? All right? Paperless hymnal's the way to go, really. So, listen, you see how this works, though. Eastern thought is like, let me take you on this journey, let me explain it, let me let you discover it. Western thought is, tell it to me, tell me why, and then tell me what you told me. Romans think Western thought, all right? Romans are very oriented towards action and clarity and immediacy, right? Like, so that's Romans. They also are, they hold in high esteem great oration or teaching. In Roman schools, the thing they taught, like above all, if you were a great student, it wasn't because you got good grades on your math. It wasn't because you got good grades on your history tests. I mean, they were making it, history right then. So they were most concerned with your ability to speak, specifically public speaking and like debate or argument, right? And so if you were a great public speaker, a great teacher, man, that was valued above all else. People would come from all over to hear your teaching if you were a great teacher. Romans also valued entertainment. There was a very hedonistic mentality to the Romans. They had the theater, which was, they were the ones that really popularized acting out and going to the theater. That was part of Roman culture, was going and enjoying entertainment in that form. Power was a very important thing to Romans. To gauge someone's prestige was to gauge how much authority or power they had over others and other people. And then victory, like competition, and specifically victory, was something very, very important to Romans. And this shows because they had sports. The Romans are the ones that brought in the Olympic Games. That was part of Roman culture, was come to the Colosseum and see the theater. Come to the Colosseum and see the games, the sports that we bring. Okay, and so does that sound kind of familiar? It should. We're Westerners. We're kind of the Romans in the story here. But here's the deal. This is Mark's audience. So how is Mark going to cater to that Roman audience? Well, he's going to picture Jesus as doing all of the things that Romans value. In the Gospel of Mark, the word immediately is used 41 times in 16 chapters, which means, I'm not going to do math, several times a chapter, the word immediately is used to describe things that are happening. When you read through Mark, and this happened, and immediately he went there, and immediately he was teaching, and immediately he left, and immediately the crowds came. It's action paced. The pacing of the Gospel of Mark is rapid, right? Jesus is doing things quickly and clearly, right? He doesn't take a minute and slow down for 3 chapters and tell you, here's the sermon Jesus preached. Find all the little nuggets of wisdom inside. No, he says, and Jesus cast out demons, and Jesus healed people, and Jesus taught this thing, and Jesus responded in this way, and these people challenged him, and Jesus defeated them. You see, the gospel is different, and he caters it towards that fast-paced, Western-thinking Roman crowd. Think about this. There's another word that comes up several times in the Gospel of Mark, and it's this word amazed. And this is not particularly unique to Mark. The crowds are amazed or astonished at Jesus in the other Gospels as well. But in Mark, it's very clear that the crowd is like its own entity, all right, in the Gospel of Mark. The crowds are constantly coming after Jesus, and there was a crowd, and the crowd came. It's like the crowd has a persona in the Gospel of Mark. It follows Jesus. It encourages or thinks things about Jesus all the time. And so this crowd, the fact that Jesus can draw a crowd is really important. We'll talk about that in just a second. But this crowd that follows Jesus is constantly amazed. I counted up at least 9 times where the crowd is amazed or astonished. And I think that's low. I think it happens actually more than that. That was just my quick count. And the crowd is constantly in awe of Jesus and what he's doing. Look at Mark chapter 7. In Mark 7 and verse 37, the verse here is that they were astonished beyond measure. He has done all things well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. So right before this, you've got this story about a deaf man, and someone comes to him and he needs to be healed, and Jesus says 2 words, right? Be opened. And the man's healed. And it's incredible. And as a result of this, right, they're seeing what he does, and they say, man, this guy is talented. Not really, but you kind of hear that comment. He does all things well. There's nothing this guy isn't good at. In fact, he's so good at things, he can even make the mute speak. This is incredible, right? I'm gonna be honest, he's kind of entertaining. People pay money to go watch people play sports. Why? Because they're exceptional at it, right? Because they're because they do it so well. No one came and paid money to watch me play sports. Why? There was a severe lack of talent. You see this? People are looking at Jesus and they're saying, wow, there is an entertainment value to the things that he's doing. This is amazing. Okay? So then, like we said, the crowds are following Jesus all the time. Look at Mark chapter 9 and verse 15. Mark 9 and verse 15. When the disciples, back up, verse 14. When they came to the disciples, they saw a great crowd around them and scribes arguing with them. And immediately, there's that word, all the crowd, when they saw him, Jesus, were greatly amazed and ran up to him and greeted him. I mean, you walk into a room and then you're flooded with the crowds. Again, it's like a character in the Gospel of Mark. You're flooded with, Jesus just sees these people in the distance, and as soon as they see him, they descend upon him, right? Like a mob almost, except it's not a mob. They're not angry. They're amazed, is what it says. They were greatly amazed and ran up to him and greeted him. So Jesus has this level of fame, this level of notoriety in the Gospel of Mark that, like, man, everyone wanted a piece of him. Everyone wanted just to be close to him because he was amazing. Look at Mark chapter 1. Back all the way up here to the beginning in Mark chapter 1 and verse 27. Goodness, if I could turn the page. Mark 1, Jesus heals a man with an unclean spirit. Again, the command is very simple, very succinct. Be silent and come out of him, right? And the demon came out of him. And in verse 27, and they were all amazed, so that they questioned among themselves, saying, what is this? A new teaching with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him. So there's a note here. What is the crowd noting about Jesus' presence and his personality? Well, he's got authority. He's got power. This is a powerful person. Not only is he teaching powerfully, like he's teaching with authority, but even when he commands these demons and these spirits, he does it like they listen. This is a guy with some power, with some authority in the world. And then look at Mark chapter 12. Okay, Mark chapter 12. After Jesus tells this parable of the tenants, there's a money question lying in wait. The Herodians and the Pharisees decide the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and they join forces to test Jesus about, should we pay taxes to Caesar? Jesus gives the answer that basically says, absolutely you should. In fact, you should give to whoever's image is on the thing that belongs to them, right? Like whatever thing has someone's image on it, give it to them. The implication very clearly was, Caesar's image is on this coin, give it to Caesar. God's image is on who? You. Then give yourself to God, right? Like there's a teaching here. Jesus teaches an incredible lesson. We've talked about this a number of times. It's like 4 different levels of teaching that Jesus does in just a few short sentences. And at the end of the teaching in verse 17, Jesus says, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And what does the crowd do at his teaching? They marveled. They marveled. Not like, oh, good one, or wow, that's insightful. Jaws on the floor, right? Eyes wide, brain firing in 100 different directions. That was incredible. Wow. How did he get out of that trap? How did he teach both sides of the trap something new? And anyone who was unsure, he brought them all closer to God, all at the same time. Unbelievable. Now, if the Romans valued teaching and power and fame and entertainment, and they had Western brains that valued immediacy and clarity. John is doing that in his gospel, isn't he? And so if you're a Roman who's reading this gospel from John, you're coming through this gospel and you're saying, man, that tracks. You know what? I get he was a Jew, but maybe I do want to follow this guy. He is powerful. He's captivating. He's entertaining. He is well known, right? He is an incredible he's the best teacher I've ever seen. I value those things, and Jesus does those things. So as a Roman, you get done. You get what do we say? 14 chapters into Mark. 14 chapters into Mark, and you're like, man, this is awesome. I'm going to follow that guy for sure. Powerful, master teacher, entertaining. He's victorious over these demons and these spirits. He's got He's got the Western way of thinking. It's portrayed to me in a way I understand and relate with. And then you get to the end of the story. Does anyone know how Jesus' story ends? He dies, okay? Now let me just say this. For a Roman reader, you've just invalidated the entire gospel, okay? You've just invalidated it. Like, you're telling me that we're supposed to follow this powerful, authoritative master teacher who's famous and bringing the crowds to himself and doing these amazing things. He's entertaining us. He's providing, food for us at different times. Like, you're telling me I'm supposed to follow this guy, and I'm all in. And then he dies by crucifixion of all things. The most shameful, the most disgraceful way someone could go out. I'm out. Have you guys seen the movie Friday Night Lights? I don't think I've actually seen it in its entirety. I've seen probably every part of it at different times on like TBS or TNT. You know how that works? You just flip over there and it's like, oh, this part, I think I like it. Oh, hey, the beginning. And then something comes up and so you see the whole movie but in different pieces. Anyway, I remember watching that movie. Friday Night Lights, I was like 20 years old. Spoiler alert. If you haven't seen it, close your ears, okay? But I think after 20 years, you're allowed to spoil things. Also, it was based on true events, so forget it. No more spoiler alert. The movie Friday Night Lights, it doesn't do what sports movies are supposed to do, okay? It builds up. How are sports movies supposed to go? Remember the Titans. What do they do at the end of the movie? They win the championship, right? And they overcome, and they come together, and they win, and it's amazing. What's the movie? The other one, the Texas Western, UTEP, Glory Road, right? The story about Texas Western. It was the first college to start 5 black athletes. They did it in the national championship, and they won the national championship in 1966. Daryl was there. Listen. This is the way sports movies go. At the end of the movie, the team overcomes, the underdog succeeds and wins. Friday Night Lights sets everything up so beautifully, right? There's a star running back, and then there's a not as bright star quarterback. He's kind of the underdog, and he's just real consistent and tough, and the running back is making the team, and the team is doing really well, and they're heading to the state championship, and you're kind of rooting for the whole team, but you're especially kind of rooting for the quarterback here, and the game's coming down to the wire, and they're having to play against this powerhouse high school in Texas, and the quarterback on the last play drops back, and he sees an opening, and he takes off. And you're like, the American sports movie fan in you says, this is exactly how this is supposed to end. This is exactly how it's supposed to end. He's going to be the one to do it. He hasn't gotten credit the whole movie, but he's going to be. And he goes and he makes a move and he leans one way, and then a collision and a mob of bodies. And the camera zooms out to reveal that he was down a yard short. And the team you've been rooting for the whole movie lost. And I said, what a dumb movie. I remember watching it and having that feeling. That was like, why did we watch an hour and a half of this only to love this team and then they lose? That's ridiculous. I hated it. I loved it, but I hated it. You know what I mean? That's the sentiment of the Roman reader when you get to the crucifixion. I was in on this guy. You made a case. He is exactly the kind of leader that I would be willing to follow. And then he dies? A disgraceful, embarrassing, mockery-filled death? No, thank you. Like, I don't know what you gave me all the rest of that for, because I'm not following some murdered slave. Ridiculous. So now Mark has a problem. He's run into this problem, right? He's got this story of Jesus, and he's portraying Jesus beautifully to a Roman audience. But the story doesn't end the way the Romans would want their story to end. See, a Roman would have their story end with their king conquering somebody and then being crowned Son of God. All right? That was the way the Romans thought. That's the way this story should end. After the king conquers, he then is crowned as the king of the world, the son of the gods. Like that was Roman through and through. And so that's what you're expecting as a Roman reader. And Luke has instead a story of the crucifixion. Let me tell you something about coronation ceremonies in the Roman time. We don't have everything about them, but as I understand it, we have one coronation ceremony that is very clearly outlined in history, and it is the coronation of Nero. Now, the reason this is significant is because Nero is most likely the emperor at the time of the writing of the Gospel of Mark. He would have been, if not at that time, very close to that time. So this particular ceremony that Nero went through would have been well known, all right? Would have been well known. When Nero defeated, I can't remember who it was exactly, when he was crowned king after a defeat, he went through this coronation ceremony. It's Coronation Day if you're a Frozen fan, all right? A little different, though. This coronation ceremony, right? So step one of the ceremony, there are 9 steps. Step one, the Praetorian Guard gathers to hail Caesar as Lord and God, okay? So the whole Praetorian Guard would come together. Step two, royal robes, a wreath crown, and you've seen like in the Olympics, the wreath crown, and a scepter would be placed on the new Caesar, on Nero. Step three, they would lead Caesar through a procession. It would be lined with incense altars and all sorts of other things. So they would lead him through a procession. Step number 4, the Caesar, in this case Nero, is followed by a sacrifice, okay? And the sacrifice, in Nero's case, was a bull. And in front of the sacrifice, the new king would carry the instrument of death. All right, so whatever that was going to be, usually a blade of some sort to slit the throat of the animal for the sacrifice. And so Nero would carry the instrument of death, and behind him would be the sacrifice. Okay, then they would arrive at this place called Head Hill, all right, Capitoline Hill. And Caesar is offered a drink. It would be a really luxurious drink from back then, called wine mixed with myrrh. It was a very special kind of drink that would be offered to the new king, or to the Caesar, to Nero, and then Nero would refuse it and pour it out. He would refuse wine mixed with myrrh. Then, step number 6, the bull would be killed. Caesar would pronounce death or life on a host of different prisoners, and it would be a symbol of him demonstrating his power over life and death. Then, number 7, the emperor would ascend the steps of the temple, and he would have on his right the high priest, and on his left the commander of his army. Then, step number 8, Caesar would be proclaimed Lord and God, and the people would be singing his praises. Hail Caesar, Lord and God. Then the last step, they would wait for a sign from the heavens. In Nero's coronation, according to history, there was an eclipse on that exact day. Now, based on the fact that he had a bunch of astrologers and star charters, they probably knew that was going to happen on that day, because it's a lot of math, and they had a lot of ways of knowing some of that was coming, just like we do now. They probably knew it was going to happen. The common person didn't. But the king and his people did, so they do this on that day. And then, oh my goodness, an eclipse! Nero must be the king. In fact, Nero must be the Son of God. That's who he is. Okay, so this is the way this goes. So here's what Mark does. Mark is going to take that coronation ceremony and overlay it onto the crucifixion. Go to Mark chapter 15. Mark chapter 15, Jesus is ready to be crucified. And when you start in verse 16, Mark chapter 15 and verse 16, remember, step 1, the Praetorian Guard gathers to hail Caesar as Lord and God, the whole Praetorian Guard. Verse 16 of chapter 15, and the soldiers led him away inside the palace, that is the governor's headquarters, and they called together the whole battalion. The whole, for one, he's a teacher, he's not even like a insurrectionist or a violent person, like the whole battalion for one guy? Interesting. Okay, so then look at verse 17. And they clothed him in a purple cloak, and twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on him, and they began to salute him, Hail, King of the Jews, and they were striking his head with a reed and spitting on him and kneeling down in homage to him. Okay, hold on. Step number 2. Royal robes, a wreath crown, and a scepter are placed on Caesar. Hold on. So there was a robe, there was a crown, and then where was the scepter? It was the rod they beat him with. So they beat him with, similar. You see it? Similar. Okay, so then number 3, they lead Caesar through a procession in verse 20. When they had mocked him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him, and they led him out to crucify him. There's the procession to his death. On the way, verse 4, or step number 4, Caesar was followed by the sacrifice, a bull in Nero's case, and he carries the instrument of death. So, who was the sacrifice here? Well, let's look, verse 21. Then they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross, and they brought him to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. Pause. Who was the sacrifice? Jesus. And who carried the instrument of death? In this account, it's Simon of Cyrene was in front of him carrying the instrument of death. So Jesus is being portrayed as the sacrifice. Okay, so then, step number 5, they arrive at Capitoline Hill. Again, it's like Head Hill, the hill of the head, or the place of the skull. These are similar words, meant to be translated probably the same way. Caesar there at Head Hill is offered wine mixed with myrrh, but he refuses it. Okay, so then we've got verse 22, they brought him to the place of the skull, which means the place, Golgotha, which means the place of the skull, and they offered him what? Wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. So he's offered, but he refuses. Now, one quick thing here. Isn't Jesus offered sour wine somewhere else? Wine and myrrh are not the same thing as sour wine. In fact, they're not even offered at the same time. Here, it's offered before he's on the cross, and later, in the other accounts, he's offered a drink of sour wine when he's up on the cross. So, these are two different events, right? That should be a clue that something else is going on. Why is Mark highlighting this part of the story and not the other? Because he's trying to show you something, okay? So that's number 5. Number 6, the bull is killed and Caesar pronounces life or death on a host of prisoners, demonstrating that he has the power over life and death. Look at verse 24. They crucified him. He's killed. And divided his garments among them, casting lots for them to decide who should take each. Number 7, the emperor ascends the steps of the temple with the high priest on his right and the commander on his left. Look down at verse 27. And with him they crucified 2 robbers, one on his right and one on his left. Okay, number 8, Caesar is proclaimed Lord and God, and the people sing his praises. Look at verse 29, and we'll go down through verse 32. And those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, "Aha, you who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." So also the chief priests and the scribes mocked him to one another, saying, "He saved others, but he cannot save himself. Let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe." And those who were crucified with him also reviled him. Now, there's an important difference. Do you notice the difference? In the coronation ceremony, what are the people doing? They're praising him, right? All of them. They're praising him. He's flanked by the high priest and the captain of the army, right? And everyone is praising him. Well, in this one, it's a little bit different. In fact, they're mocking him. And they're mocking him in the exact way a Roman audience would mock the crucifixion. They'd say, "We were in on this guy for 14 chapters, and now he's being crucified. If he's as powerful as we thought he was, right? If he is this awesome guy that you've been showing me he was for the whole story, get yourself off the cross. Come down. You've got the power, right? Do it. Do it so that we can see it, and then we'll follow you. Then we'll believe." The objection is exactly the objection the Romans would have had, and so the key difference here is instead of singing his praises, he is jeered at and mocked while he's on the cross. The last part of the coronation ceremony for the Romans would be that they wait for a sign from the heavens. Step 9, they would wait for a sign from the heavens. And in verse 33, when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And some of the bystanders hearing it said, "Behold, he's calling Elijah." And some ran and filled a sponge with sour wine and put it on a reed and gave it to him to drink, saying, "Wait, let us see if Elijah will come and take him down." And then Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, And when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, there was our sign from the heavens. Right? He says, truly, this man was the Son of God. Because they were waiting for a sign from the heavens. And so Mark depicts very clearly right here the crucifixion as a coronation. So he's getting to the end of the story, and he knows his Roman audience is going to have a problem with this. And so he says, you know what? What you see as a crucifixion, I'm telling you it's different. It's better. This is actually a coronation of Jesus. Of course, the end of the story, Jesus is buried and ultimately is raised from the dead. And it shows his very clear power over death, his victory over death. You see how this all comes around to be a message that the Roman audience is all in for once again. Think about the things that Mark is saying here by portraying this story in this way. Jesus is the embodiment of all the things that you value and more than that, right? The things, really what he's saying is the things that you believe are good, the true things that you believe are good, Jesus is exactly that. He's not only that, he's more than that, right? I mean, all the way up 14 chapters, you got an audience going, oh yeah, I'm seeing it. This guy, I'm with him. And then it doesn't go the way that they want, and it goes way better than they could have imagined. Not only does he die, but he conquers death. And so now you've got, he is what you think. He is the things that you value, and he's more than that. He's better than the things that you value. There is more to God. There's more to Jesus than just the things that you see and you value. And I think the other thing that Mark is saying very clearly, I mean, the message from this crucifixion story is that God can overcome the things you think are bad. Right? It kind of has a reminiscent tone of Joseph and his brothers. The things that you meant for evil, God has used for good. Okay, no one looks at a crucifixion and says, good stuff. That's exactly how I would have drew it up, right? No one looks at it and does that. They look at that and they say defeat and a crushing defeat and humiliation and shame and disgrace. God says, you see a crucifixion, I see a coronation, right? God says, you see a broken person, I see the perfect tool. God says, you see trash, and I see treasure. See, this message that Mark is portraying here is that God sees things differently than you do. Where you might see shame and disgrace, God sees value and power. Where you might see bad, God can use and sees good. This is a message that the Roman audience needed to hear. It's a message that we need to hear. Isn't this good news? If the gospel is good news, and this is what Mark is doing, is he's trying to bring good news about a new king and a new kingdom. In this kingdom, the king sees a cross as a coronation. In this kingdom, the king sees broken people as the perfect tool for his will. In this kingdom, the king sees trash as absolute treasure. That's gospel, right? That's good news about a new king and a new kingdom. The other thing, and this is what Mark is saying, right? But the other thing about this is look at what Mark is doing. And I think this is where we really, the message we needed to hear is what Mark is saying. But the lesson that we can learn and maybe apply is really from what Mark is doing. He is bringing the gospel to a group of people in a way that they can see its value, right? He is relating to a group of Romans in a way that Romans will understand and appreciate. He doesn't come in and say, hey, look at all this Old Testament stuff that none of you have read, right? He doesn't come in and say, now let me change the way you think for a little bit, right? He doesn't come in and say, yeah, you're Romans, but listen to this cool Jewish. He comes in and he says, listen, you're Romans, you value these things? Here they are. Like we said a second ago, he's the embodiment of the true things that you value. When I say true things, I mean, there are things that we value that are true to who God is and to the truth that we can know in the world. And then there are things that we value that just, aren't. right? Because we're imperfect people, a nice blend of good and bad in our thoughts and our values. And so there are things that we value that are true. And what Mark does is he takes those things that you see that are true, and he says, here, Jesus is the embodiment of those true things. Really what he's doing is he is showing a group of people a side of God that they will find enticing. Okay? He's not showing victims of abuse the stories about an angry God. He's showing the victims of abuse the stories of a loving God. Right? He's not showing these people, these Romans, parts of God that they would have a hard time with. He's showing these Romans, he's bringing them in by saying, look, these are the parts of God that you would value. Come get to know the rest of him, right? Come get to know because you may not value these other parts, right? Maybe I shouldn't start with those. You may not value those right now, but when you get to know who this God is, every bit of him is good, right? You may not particularly like this part right now, but when you understand who God is, you're going to find how powerful and how amazing that part of him is. But come here. Come here. This is what will bring you in. This is what we'll use. It's reminiscent of Mark. What Mark is doing is reminiscent of Paul. When he goes into Athens in Acts 17, does he go in and just beat him over the head with Yahweh is the only true and living God. All these other gods are foolish. I mean, certainly he'd have been within his right, wouldn't he? Instead, how does he go into the city? Acts chapter 17, Paul goes into Athens and he says, a lot of statues. I guess you guys are kind of religious. You seem to be interested in mythology, so to speak. Let me tell you about this God who's pretty mysterious. He's the one you don't know, right? It gives us a detail in there that the Athenians just wanted to hear something new, right? So what does Paul do? So I can start there, right? I can start there. Let me tell you something new. And then as you get into this, you're going to get to know who this God really is. You think about Philip on the road on the road to Damascus. I'm mixing all my stories up. Think about Philip with the eunuch, right? They're on the road. They're in the chariot, and the eunuch happens to just so happens to have a Jesus prophecy in his hand. I mean, like that's obviously nice. But where did Philip start with the eunuch? With his question about his passage that he had in his hand. He said, that's what you want to hear about? Let's start there. Let me tell you about this suffering servant right there. Okay? Then we'll get into the other stuff. Don't you think that the suffering servant related to the eunuch of all people? This is a man who was castrated so that he could serve as a servant to the queen and not have any fear of anything going wrong. He was a servant for the rest of his life. And that's where Philip starts. It's a story about a suffering. You think the eunuch understood a suffering servant? Surely he did. Listen, what Mark is doing is he is bringing the gospel to people in a way that they can see its value, in a way that will relate to them. Does that mean he's hiding part of who God is? No, absolutely not. I mean, does that mean that he's only telling them the good parts that they want to hear? No, absolutely not. It means that he is bringing them in by relating to them, helping them see that Jesus is the embodiment of the true things that you value in the world. Now come get to know the rest of him because he's incredible. And so if Mark is doing this with his gospel, and Mark is teaching a message that God can overcome, that God sees a coronation where you see a crucifixion, man, I feel like I shouldn't have to give this part, but that's what we need to be doing, is it not? That's what we ought to be doing. We ought to be able to bring the gospel to people in a way that they will value it. Amen. We ought to be able to bring the gospel to people. You got to learn who people are, right? You got to find out what they value. So there's a relational element in this from the get-go, but you got to be able to bring the gospel to people in a way that it's going to impact them. And then help them see the rest of who God is. Don't leave them there. Bring them to completion. Show them the rest of the message. That, there are parts of this that you're going to track with right away. Then there are parts of it that you are not going to like. But even those parts are powerful parts of who God is. Because when you see a cross, he sees a coronation. And this is the theme, the main theme in the Gospel of Mark. It's a letter written to some Romans, written in a way that Romans would understand. Mark shows us very clearly how to take the good news about a new king and a new kingdom and bring that to people where they are. Not in any way hiding part of God, but bringing it to people so that they will be receptive to the gospel. And then we get to see Paul do it later. And I think it's something we need to put into practice. This gospel message is for everybody. Many of us here tonight have already heard the gospel and believed it. If you haven't, then this is the time. But more than that, if you've not been doing the things that a Christian needs to be doing, we have a time. This invitation started off as an invitation that said, hey, anytime you need to obey the gospel, the invitation is open. That holds true today. This invitation has kind of morphed into a time where if you need to talk to the church, we're all here right now. It's a great time to come let us know what you need. And so if you need prayers of the church, or if you need to dedicate yourself to Christ, or if you need to obey the gospel for the first time, that's what this time is for. So your family can be here, listen to you, and love you in the end. Whatever you need tonight, you can come forward while we stand and sing.